Hey everybody, welcome back to Study Hall. I'm excited for today's deep dive. We're going to be tackling U.S.-Mexico relations,
Oh, yeah.
specifically this new executive order about border security and tariffs.
This is a big one?
Yeah, and it's one of those things that you hear about on the news and you're like, wait a second, what's actually going on?
Yeah, definitely a lot of layers here.
So let's break it down, like what's at the core of this executive order.
Well, at its heart, the order claims that Mexico is not doing enough to combat drug trafficking and illegal immigration, and says that this poses a serious threat to U.S. national security.
Okay, so the U.S. government's saying Mexico's efforts are insufficient. But what does that actually mean? Like, where's the evidence for that?
That's a good question. The order itself doesn't really give specific evidence, but it points to things like the flow of fentanyl across the border and the high number of migrants apprehended at the U.S.-Mexico border.
I see.
It's trying to paint a picture of a situation that's, spiraling out of control.
Okay, so they're saying it's a problem, but they're not giving a lot of specifics.
Right.
And then the solution, according to this executive order, is tariffs.
Yeah, that seems to be the main tool they're proposing.
Okay, so walk me through that. What are we talking about here?
So initially, the order proposed a 25% ad valorem tariff on all goods imported from Mexico.
25%? That's a lot.
It is. And to give you an idea of what that means, like, imagine you go to the grocery store
Yeah.
and that avocado you always buy, suddenly it's 25% more expensive.
Ouch.
That's the kind of impact we're talking about.
Yeah, that hits the wallet right where it hurts.
For sure.
But wait, didn't you say this tariff was paused or something? What's going on with that?
You're right. The implementation is on hold for the moment.
Okay.
The order states that Mexico needs to take more concrete steps to address these threats that we were talking about. The drug trafficking and illegal immigration.
So it's like they're saying, hey, shape up or we're hitting you with these tariffs.
Pretty much it's like a warning shot.
So then the question becomes, what kind of progress are we talking about here? What would Mexico have to do to get the U.S. government to back off?
Well, that's where things get a little bit vague.
Okay.
The order doesn't really clearly define what actions would be considered sufficient. Some people think it could involve increasing border security on Mexico's southern border,
Okay.
maybe cracking down on certain cartels or even extraditing individuals involved in drug trafficking.
I see.
But it's not really laid out in black and white.
So there's a lot of room for interpretation there.
Absolutely.
And how would the U.S. even assess whether Mexico's making enough progress? Like, who's making that call?
That's a good question. The order puts the responsibility on several key players, mainly the Secretary of Homeland Security, but also the Secretary of State, the Attorney General, and advisors on national security and homeland security.
Wow. So it's a whole team effort.
It is a lot of different perspectives involved.
And a lot of bureaucracy, I imagine.
Definitely.
So these departments are basically watching the situation like hawks.
Yeah, keeping a close eye on things.
And they're advising the president on whether Mexico's actions are enough to keep the tariffs paused.
Exactly.
But let's say things don't improve, or the U.S. decides Mexico isn't doing enough. These tariffs could still go into effect, right?
Oh, absolutely. The deadline for that is March 4th, 2025.
Wow, so that's not too far off.
No, not at all.
And you said if the situation worsens, what does that actually mean? Like, are there specific metrics or thresholds that they're using to measure this?
That's a key point, and unfortunately, it's not clearly defined in the order.
Interesting.
It's left intentionally vague, which gives the U.S. government a lot of leeway in how they interpret the situation.
Okay, so it's like a subjective judgment call.
Pretty much, yeah.
Well, that adds another layer of complexity to this whole thing.
It definitely does.
Okay, so we've got this looming threat of tariffs. But before we get into the potential consequences of that, I want to go back to something you mentioned earlier, the legal justification for these tariffs.
Oh, right.
You said it had something to do with the International Emergency Economic Powers Act,
Yeah.
the National Emergencies Act, and some trade-related legislation.
Exactly. Those are the legal frameworks they're citing in the executive order.
Okay, so break that down for me. I'm not a lawyer.
Well, the IEEPA, for short, essentially allows the president to impose economic sanctions during a declared national emergency.
So like in a time of war or something.
It can be used in a variety of situations, freezing assets, imposing trade restrictions, things like that.
Okay.
It's a pretty powerful tool.
So in this case, by declaring a national emergency related to border security, the president is invoking the IEPA to justify these tariffs.
You got it. That's exactly how they're using it.
And the National Emergencies Act is what gives the president the power to declare such an emergency in the first place.
Right.
And then the trade-related legislation provides the specific mechanisms for actually implementing the tariffs.
Exactly. It's like a chain of legal authority all leading to the president having this power.
Okay, so it's not like he's just making this up on the fly.
No, there's a whole legal framework behind it.
Okay, so there's a lot of legal weight behind this executive order.
For sure.
And I'm guessing that's why they included this severability clause that you mentioned?
You're on the right track. The severability clause is basically a safety net for the whole executive order. It states that even if some parts of the order are challenged in court and found to be unlawful, the remaining sections still stay in effect.
Oh, I see. So it's like they're trying to make it bulletproof.
Exactly. Even if one part gets knocked down, the rest of it can still stand.
So even if a court were to say that the tariffs themselves are illegal, other elements of the order, like the increased security measures or the monitoring mechanisms, could still stay in place.
Precisely.
Wow, this is all pretty serious stuff.
It is. The U.S. government seems really determined to use everything they've got to address what they see as a major threat.
Yeah, it definitely seems like an escalation in U.S.-Mexico relations.
Absolutely. And we need to understand all the complexities of this situation because it's not just about abstract policies and numbers. This is about real people whose lives are being directly affected by these decisions. It's easy to get caught up in all the legal stuff and the politics.
Yeah.
But we can't forget that this is about real people, you know?
People on both sides of the border.
Exactly. Their lives are connected in so many ways.
So let's talk about that. What are the potential consequences of this situation for everyday people?
Well, on the U.S. side, if these tariffs actually go into effect, we're probably going to see prices go up for a lot of things we get from Mexico.
Like what?
They produce cars, electronics, all kinds of stuff.
So it's not just my avocados getting more expensive.
No, it's way bigger than that.
Okay.
We're talking about a major disruption to the economy, possible job losses. It could be a real mess.
Wow.
And then on the Mexican side, it could be even worse.
Yeah, I imagine their economy is really vulnerable to these tariffs.
They rely heavily on exports to the U.S., so these tariffs could really hurt their economic growth.
And potentially lead to more instability and unrest.
Exactly, and that could actually make the problems the U.S. is trying to solve even worse.
It's like a vicious cycle.
Yeah, you hit them with tariffs, their economy suffers, and then you have more migration and more instability. It's counterproductive.
It's interesting, though, because the executive order itself seemed to acknowledge that there are two sides to this coin.
What do you mean?
Well, there's the stick of the tariffs, but there's also the carrot of potential economic benefits if Mexico cooperates.
Right. The pause on the tariffs is a way to give them an incentive to take action.
But it also puts a lot of pressure on them to get results quickly.
Exactly. It's a risky strategy.
It reminds me of other trade disputes we've seen recently. The U.S. seems to be using tariffs more and more as a negotiating tactic.
Yeah, it's become a pretty common tool in international relations.
But it feels like a blunt instrument, you know?
Absolutely. And it often has unintended consequences. You have to be really careful with tariffs.
I think it's important for us to step back and consider the different perspectives at play here. The executive order focuses on the threat of drug trafficking and illegal immigration. But are there other ways of looking at this situation?
Oh, definitely. Some people argue that the whole security threat is being blown out of proportion.
Really?
They think the real motivation behind this is economic protectionism.
So they're saying it's more about protecting American businesses than about security.
That's one way to look at it. Others say that the U.S. is just trying to flex its muscles and force Mexico to do what it wants.
Like a power play.
Exactly.
It's fascinating how one executive order can be interpreted in so many different ways.
It shows how important it is to think critically and consider multiple perspectives.
Speaking of, what about the evidence for the claims being made in the executive order?
Yeah, let's look at that.
Is there actually data to support the idea that Mexico isn't doing enough to combat drug trafficking and illegal immigration?
Well, it's complicated. There's data that supports different interpretations. For example, drug seizures at the U.S.-Mexico border have actually increased in recent years.
Really? So that kind of goes against the idea that Mexico isn't doing enough.
It does, but those who support the executive order argue that those seizures are just a drop in the bucket.
Okay.
They point to the opioid crisis in the U.S. as evidence that drug trafficking is still a huge problem.
So it depends on how you interpret the data.
Exactly.
And what about illegal immigration?
Similar story. Apprehensions at the border have gone up and down over the years. But it's hard to say whether that's because more people are trying to cross illegally or just because enforcement is getting better.
Right. So maybe it's not that more people are crossing, but that more are getting caught.
Possibly. And it's important to remember that many of those being apprehended are actually seeking asylum, which is a legal process.
Right. So lumping them in with people who are crossing illegally can be misleading.
Absolutely. It's crucial to make that distinction.
It sounds like there's a lot of nuance to these issues.
There is, and it's easy to oversimplify things or misrepresent the data.
So we have to be careful about the information we consume.
And always be willing to look at things from different angles.
I've learned so much from this conversation.
You do?
You've really helped me unpack this whole executive order situation.
Gotta hear it.
It's clear that this is a really complex issue with no easy answers.
Yeah, there's a lot at stake here.
It really makes you think about the bigger picture.
Yeah.
We've talked about the economic impact, the legal stuff, the data on drug trafficking and migration.
Right.
But what does all of this mean for the future of U.S.-Mexico relations?
That's the big question, isn't it? This executive order could really strain the relationship between the two countries.
In what way?
Well, it creates this atmosphere of distrust. Like the U.S. doesn't trust Mexico to handle these issues. And that can make it really hard to cooperate on other things, things they both care about.
Right, like they need to work together on so many issues.
Exactly, trade, environmental protection, all sorts of things.
So even if Mexico does what the U.S. is asking for, there could still be damage to the relationship.
Oh, absolutely. Mexico could feel like they were bullied into it,
Yeah.
And that can lead to resentment. It can make them want to distance themselves from the U.S.
So this could actually push Mexico further away instead of bringing them closer.
It's a real possibility. It's like a lose-lose situation.
We've talked about a lot of potential negative consequences.
Right.
But are there any potential benefits here? Could this situation actually lead to something good?
It's always possible if Mexico takes concrete action to address those concerns about drug trafficking and immigration.
Yeah.
It could actually improve security and stability for both countries.
So maybe this pressure from the U.S. will force them to act.
That's the hope from the U.S. perspective, at least.
But even if that happens, even if drug trafficking and immigration go down, wouldn't the cost be too high? The economic damage, the harm to the relationship?
That's a valid point.
Yeah.
A lot of people think there are better ways to address these challenges.
Like what?
A more cooperative approach,
Okay.
Diplomacy, foreign aid, addressing the root causes of migration.
Right, because people are migrating for a reason.
Exactly. Poverty, violence, lack of opportunity. Those are the things pushing people north.
And you can't just solve those problems with tariffs and border walls.
Exactly. It takes a more holistic approach, understanding that these issues are connected.
And that the U.S. and Mexico need to work together to solve them.
That's the key, cooperation and understanding.
So what can we as individuals do? We've learned a lot about this issue.
Right.
But how can we actually make a difference?
That's a great question. I think the first step is to stay informed.
Okay.
Read about these issues from different sources. Don't just rely on one perspective.
We've got to get the whole picture.
Exactly. And then talk about it with other people, have those difficult conversations. And most importantly, take action.
Like what?
Support organizations that are working to address the root causes of migration.
Okay.
Contact your elected officials. Let them know you care about this issue.
Right. Make our voices heard.
Exactly. We can all do our part to create a more just and equitable world.
It's easy to feel overwhelmed by all of this, but it's important to remember that we can make a difference.
Absolutely. Every little bit counts.
Well, this has been a really insightful deep dive. Thank you so much for sharing your expertise with us.
It's been my pleasure. I always enjoy these conversations.
And to all our listeners out there, thank you for joining us on Study Hall.
Yeah, thanks for listening.
We hope you learned something new today about U.S.-Mexico relations and the complexities of this executive order. Remember, stay curious, stay informed, and stay engaged until next time. Keep learning.